The rain came down in sheets that November evening, turning the city streets into rivers of light and shadow. Inside the warehouse of Sterling Logistics, David Chen wiped the sweat from his forehead and checked his watch. 9:30. He was supposed to be home 2 hours ago. His daughter Sophie was waiting for him. She was only 8 years old, staying with Mrs. Patterson from next door, probably already in her pajamas and asking when Daddy would be home. David felt that familiar weight in his chest, the one that came with being both mother and father to a little girl who'd lost her mom too soon. 3 years. It had been 3 years since cancer took his wife Linda away, leaving him to figure out everything on his own. How to braid hair, how to handle playground drama, how to make a salary that barely covered rent stretch far enough to also cover school supplies and birthday parties, and all the little things that made childhood worth remembering. David was 34 but felt older. His co-workers at the warehouse knew him as the quiet guy, who never complained, who always showed up on time, who picked up extra shifts when someone called in sick. Tonight, that someone was Jerry, whose kid had come down with the flu. He remembered all the times he'd needed someone to cover for him when Sophie was sick, when parent-teacher conferences ran late, when life as a single dad got overwhelming. He finished his paperwork and grabbed his jacket from the break room. The warehouse was finally quiet after the chaos of the evening shift. His supervisor, Tony, waved him off with a tired smile. "Get home safe, Chen. That's some nasty weather out there." David nodded and headed out into the rain. His truck, a beaten-up Ford with over 200,000 miles on it, started on the third try. He made a mental note to get the starter checked when he could afford it. The list of things he needed to do when he could afford them just kept getting longer. The drive home took him through downtown, across the old bridge that spanned the river. Traffic was light because of the weather. Smart people were already home, warm and dry. David turned up the heater and thought about what he'd make for Sophie's lunch tomorrow. They were running low on groceries again. Payday wasn't until Friday. He was halfway across the bridge when he saw the brake lights ahead flash red, then swerve wildly. The car, some expensive-looking sedan, hydroplaned on the wet road. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. The vehicle spun, crashed through the metal guardrail with a horrible screech of tearing steel, and came to rest hanging halfway over the edge. The front end dangled above the churning river below, while the back wheels clung desperately to the pavement. David's heart hammered in his chest. He hit his brakes, pulling to the side of the road. Other cars slowed down. He could see faces behind windshields, phones coming up to call for help. But nobody stopped. Nobody got out. The sedan's engine smoked. Through the rain-streaked windows, David could make out someone in the driver's seat. Slumped forward, he should wait for the police, for the fire department, for someone trained to handle this. But the car was already slipping, inch by inch, toward the edge, and whoever was inside didn't have time to wait. David threw his truck into park and jumped out. The rain hit him like a cold slap. He ran toward the crashed car, his work boots splashing through puddles, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it over the storm. Behind him, someone honked. Maybe trying to warn him. Maybe just annoyed that he was blocking traffic. Up close, the scene was worse. The guardrail had torn like paper. The sedan balanced on the broken edge, held in place by nothing but luck and physics. Any wrong move could send it tumbling into the river 30 feet below. David approached carefully, testing each step. The pavement was slick, and the last thing anyone needed was for him to slip and make things worse. Through the driver's side window, he could see a young woman, maybe in her late 20s. Her head rested against the deployed airbag. Blood ran down from a cut on her temple. "Hey!" David shouted, banging on the window. "Can you hear me?" No response. The woman didn't move. The car groaned and shifted forward another inch. David's stomach dropped. He grabbed the door handle and pulled. Locked. Of course it was locked. Modern cars locked automatically in crashes. He looked around desperately. A piece of the broken guardrail lay nearby. a jagged chunk of metal about the size of his forearm. David grabbed it and, saying a silent prayer, smashed it against the driver's side window. The safety glass spider-webbed, but didn't break. He hit it again, harder, putting all his strength behind it. The window shattered. David knocked away the remaining glass and reached inside to unlock the door. The car shifted again, tilting forward. The rear wheels were lifting off the ground now. "Come on," David muttered, yanking the door open. The woman was held in place by her seatbelt, and his cold fingers fumbled with the release button. The seatbelt clicked free. David got his arms under hers and started pulling. She was dead weight, unconscious, and he had to be careful not to hurt her more while also moving fast enough to beat the car's slide toward the river. The vehicle groaned again, a deep metallic sound that made David's blood run cold. No more time. He pulled hard, dragging the woman out of the driver's seat. Her body slumped against him as he backed away from the car. One step, then another, supporting her weight. His foot slipped on the wet pavement. For one terrifying second, David thought they were both going down. But he caught himself, kept his balance, kept moving. 3 more steps. 4. 5. Behind them, the sedan gave up its fight with gravity. The rear wheels lifted completely off the ground, and the car tilted forward. For a moment, it seemed to hang in the air, then it fell, tumbling down toward the dark water below. The splash echoed across the river, and within seconds, the vehicle disappeared beneath the surface. David stood there in the rain, the unconscious woman in his arms, staring at the spot where the car had been just moments before. If he'd been 5 seconds slower, if he'd hesitated, if he'd driven past like everyone else. He heard sirens in the distance. Someone had called it in. David carefully lowered the woman to the ground, positioning her on her side in case she needed to breathe better. He checked her pulse. Steady, rating, strong. She was alive. Police cars and an ambulance arrived, lights flashing in the rain. Paramedics rushed over with a stretcher and equipment. David stepped back, letting them work. His hands were shaking. The adrenaline that had carried him through the rescue was fading, leaving him cold and exhausted. A police officer approached him, asking for his statement. David explained what he'd seen, what he'd done. The officer wrote everything down and asked for his contact information. David gave his name and phone number, but his mind was somewhere else. On Sophie, waiting for him. On how he'd almost not made it home tonight. The paramedics loaded the woman into the ambulance. One of them jogged over to David. "You should come to the hospital too. Get checked out." To testery. David shook his head. "I'm okay. I need to get home to my daughter." Before anyone could argue, before the reporters who were starting to arrive could ask him questions, David walked back to his truck. He climbed in, started the engine, and pulled away from the chaos. His clothes were soaked. His hands had finally stopped shaking. When he got home, Mrs. Patterson opened the door with relief written all over her face. "Oh, thank goodness." I was starting to worry. Sophie came running, throwing her arms around his wet jacket. "Daddy, you're all soggy." David hugged her tight, breathing in the strawberry scent of her shampoo. "Sorry, I'm late, sweetheart. Work ran over." He didn't tell her about the bridge, the crash, the woman he'd pulled from a car seconds before it fell into the river. Maybe someday he would. But tonight, he just wanted to be dad, making hot chocolate, and reading bedtime stories. As Sophie drifted off to sleep in her room, David sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea, his mind replaying the evening. He'd saved someone's life tonight. Someone's daughter. Someone's loved one. He thought about Linda, about how precious life was, how quickly it could end. He had no idea who the woman was. He probably never would. And that was okay. He hadn't done it for recognition or reward. He'd done it because when someone needed help, you helped. Simple as that. David finished his tea, checked the locks, and headed to bed. Tomorrow would bring the same challenges, the same struggles to make ends meet. But tonight, someone was alive, because he'd been there. And that had to mean something. Life went back to normal faster than David expected. The morning after the rescue, he woke up sore, his muscles aching from pulling that woman from the car. But Sophie needed breakfast. And he needed to get to work. So he pushed through it, like he pushed through everything else. At the warehouse, a couple of guys had seen the news coverage about the bridge accident. A reporter had filmed the aftermath, catching glimpses of the rescue. But the footage was grainy and dark. Nobody connected the blurry figure in the rain to David Chen from shipping and receiving. "Did you hear about that crazy crash last night?" Tony asked during their morning break. "Some lady almost went into the river. Lucky some guy stopped to help." David sipped his coffee and nodded. "Yeah, I heard something about that." He didn't elaborate. What was there to say? He'd done what needed doing. Talking about it felt like bragging. And David had never been the type to seek attention. Besides, he had more pressing concerns. Sophie's school had sent home a note about needing new winter boots. Her old ones from last year barely fit anymore. Kids grew so fast, and every growth spurt meant another expense he hadn't budgeted for. The week rolled on. Wake up, make Sophie breakfast, drop her at school, work a full shift, pick her up, help with homework, make dinner, read stories, tuck her in, collapse into bed exhausted, repeat. This was David's life. And he'd accepted it. Some days were harder than others. But he had Sophie, and that made every struggle worth it. On Thursday, Sophie's teacher asked to speak with him after school. Mrs. Kim was a kind woman in her 50s who genuinely cared about her students. David's heart sank as he walked into the classroom, already running through possible problems in his head. Was Sophie acting out? Falling behind? "Mr. Chen, please sit," Mrs. Kim said with a warm smile. "Don't worry, Sophie's doing wonderfully. I wanted to talk to you about the winter concert next month. Sophie has a beautiful singing voice. And I'd like to give her a small solo part." Relief flooded through David. "That's great. She loves to sing. There's just one thing, Mrs. Kim continued gently. The performance is on a Wednesday evening. I know you work late sometimes, and I wanted to make sure you'd be able to attend. It would mean the world to her." David's mind raced through the work schedule. Wednesday was inventory night. He was always there for inventory. But this was Sophie. He'd figure something out. "I'll be there. I promise." Mrs. Kim's smile deepened. "She talks about you all the time. You know. How hard you work. How you make her favorite pancakes on Sundays. You're doing an amazing job." David left the school feeling lighter than he had in days. Maybe he couldn't afford fancy vacations or the newest toys. But he could show up. He could be there. That had to count for something. Meanwhile, across the city, in a private room at Metropolitan Hospital, Victoria Sterling stared out the window at the skyline. Her head still ached from the concussion, and her ribs were wrapped tight where they'd cracked during the accident. But she was alive. And according to the doctors, she was incredibly lucky. She was the only daughter of Richard Sterling, the CEO of Sterling Logistics. At 29, Victoria had worked her way up to Vice President of Operations, determined to prove she'd earned her position through merit, not nepotism. She was sharp, driven, and fiercely independent. The accident had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. Her father sat beside her bed, gray-haired and exhausted. Richard Sterling was a self-made man who'd built his company from nothing, and his daughter was the center of his world. Losing his wife to illness years ago had nearly broken him. The thought of losing Victoria, too, was unbearable. "The police are still trying to identify the man who pulled you out," Richard said, scrolling through his phone. "The footage is too dark to make out his face clearly, and he left before the paramedics could get his full information. Victoria closed her eyes, trying to remember. She had flashes of that night. The spin, the impact, the terrifying sensation of dangling over the edge, and then a voice, cutting through the fog. "Stay with me. I've got you." Strong arms pulling her. The feeling of safety just before everything went black. "I need to find him," Victoria said quietly. "He saved my life, Dad." He risked his own life for a complete stranger. "We'll find him," Richard assured her. But days passed with no leads. The man had given the police a name and phone number, but in the chaos of the scene, the officer's notes were incomplete. The number was missing a digit. The name was common enough that searching through city records yielded thousands of possibilities. Victoria grew frustrated. She wasn't used to feeling helpless. She was someone who solved problems, who took action. Being stuck in a hospital bed while some hero who'd saved her remained anonymous felt wrong. By the following Monday, Victoria was cleared to go home with strict orders to rest. Her father had a different idea. "Come to the office with me," he suggested. "Just for a few hours. Being around the business might help you feel more like yourself." Victoria agreed, though she still tired easily. At Sterling Logistics headquarters, employees welcomed her back with flowers and well wishes. She smiled and thanked them, but her mind was elsewhere, still replaying fragments of the accident. That afternoon, Richard made an announcement that surprised everyone, including Victoria. He called a company-wide meeting and addressed the staff via video conference. "I'm going to be doing something I should have done years ago," Richard said, his voice carrying that authority that had built an empire. "I'm going to visit every one of our facilities personally. Not just the corporate offices, but the warehouses, the distribution centers, everywhere our people work." Victoria looked at her father in surprise. He'd always been focused on the big picture, on board meetings and investor calls. This personal touch wasn't his usual style. Richard continued. "Recent events have reminded me what really matters. The people. The individuals who make this company run. I want to meet you. Shake your hands. Hear your ideas. We're starting with our main warehouse facility next week." The announcement sent ripples through the company. At the downtown warehouse, Tony gathered his team with the news. Corporate's coming to visit. Big Boss himself, plus his daughter. They want everything spotless, and they want to see our best safety protocols in action. He turned to David. "Chen, you're leading the safety presentation. You know our procedures better than anyone, and you've got that calm way of explaining things." David's stomach dropped. "Me? You'll do fine. Just talk about what you do every day. Keep people safe. Show them how the warehouse runs." David wanted to refuse, but Tony had backed him up too many times when he'd needed to leave early for Sophie or take a sick day. He couldn't say no. "Okay, I'll do it. 9, 2, 9, 9, 9, 9. That evening, Sophie noticed her dad seemed distracted while they made dinner together. She was mixing a salad while he stirred pasta sauce. "What's wrong, Daddy?" she asked. David smiled down at her. "Just got a big presentation at work next week. I'm a little nervous." Sophie grabbed his hand with her small one. "You'll be great. You're the bravest person I know." If only she knew how her simple words could make everything feel manageable. David squeezed her hand back. "Thanks, sweetheart." Over the next few days, David prepared his presentation during lunch breaks. He kept it simple and focused on the practical things that kept workers safe. Check your equipment. Don't take shortcuts. Look out for your teammates. If you see something dangerous, speak up. The night before the CEO's visit, David couldn't sleep. He lay in bed thinking about the presentation, about not embarrassing himself in front of the big bosses. He thought about the woman from the bridge, too, wondering if she'd recovered, if she was back with her family. He had no way of knowing that in less than 12 hours, his quiet, ordinary life was about to intersect with hers in a way he never could have imagined. Sophie appeared in his doorway, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "Can't sleep?" "Neither can you, apparently," David said, lifting his blanket so she could climb in beside him. She snuggled close. "I heard you talking to yourself. You're worried about tomorrow." "A little," David admitted. "Just be yourself," Sophie said with the simple wisdom of an 8-year-old. "That's always enough." Quote, quote, quote. David kissed the top of her head, breathing in that strawberry shampoo smell. "When did you get so smart?" "I learned from the best," she said, already drifting off to sleep. David held his daughter and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow, the CEO of the entire company would be walking through his warehouse. He'd have to stand up in front of everyone and talk about safety procedures. It felt like the biggest moment of his career. He had no idea that the biggest moment of his life was actually about to unfold. That the woman whose life he'd saved without a second thought was coming to find him. That gratitude and grace were about to collide in a way that would change everything. But that was tomorrow's story. Tonight, he was just a dad, holding his sleeping daughter, hoping he wouldn't let anyone down when morning came. The morning of the CEO's visit arrived with clear skies and cold air. David dropped Sophie at school earlier than usual, giving himself extra time to get to the warehouse and go over his presentation one last time. She hugged him tight before running to join her friends. "Good luck, Daddy. You've got this." Her confidence in him made David stand a little straighter. If an 8-year-old believed in him, maybe he could believe in himself too. The warehouse was transformed when he arrived. The floors gleamed. Equipment sat in perfectly straight lines. Even the break room had been deep cleaned. The old coffee stains scrubbed away. Tony was running around with a clipboard, checking things off his list and barking orders at anyone within earshot. "Chen, there you are. You ready?" David nodded, though his stomach felt like it was tied in knots. "Just remember, keep it simple. These corporate folks love hearing from real workers. Don't try to sound fancy. Be yourself." The same advice Sophie had given him. Maybe there was something to it. By 10 o'clock, word spread that the CEO's convoy had arrived. 3 black SUVs pulled up to the warehouse entrance. David watched from inside as Richard Sterling stepped out, looking every bit the powerful executive in his tailored suit. Behind him came several assistants and security personnel. And then Victoria Sterling emerged from the second vehicle. David felt a strange jolt of recognition, but he couldn't place why. She wore a navy blazer and slacks. Her dark hair pulled back professionally. There was a small scar on her temple, still healing, partially covered by her hair. She moved carefully, like someone still recovering from an injury. Tony rushed forward to greet them, shaking hands and leading the group inside. David hung back with the other workers, trying to blend into the background until his presentation. But as the group toured the facility, he found his eyes drawn to the woman. Something about her seemed familiar, but he couldn't figure out what. Victoria walked beside her father, nodding as Tony explained the warehouse operations. But she seemed distracted, her gaze moving from face to face among the workers. She was searching for something, or someone. The tour continued through the different sections. Richard asked questions about efficiency and workflow. Victoria remained mostly quiet, still scanning the employees they passed. Her head ached slightly, a reminder from the doctors not to push herself too hard, but she'd insisted on coming. She had to be here. Finally, they reached the main floor where David's presentation was scheduled. Tony had set up a small area with a projector and screen. About 30 workers gathered around, curious to see the big boss up close and hear what he had to say. Richard addressed them first. His voice was strong, commanding respect without demanding it. "I want to thank all of you for the work you do. This company exists because of people like you, the ones who show up every day and get the job done. I should have said that in person years ago." The workers nodded, some looking surprised by the sincerity in his tone. "Now," Richard continued, "your supervisor tells me one of your team members is going to share some insights about safety protocols. I'm very interested to hear from someone on the front lines. Tony gestured to David. That's David Chen, one of our best. David's heart hammered as he walked to the front. He felt dozens of eyes on him. The CEO. The CEO's daughter. His co-workers. He clutched his notes. Though his hands were sweating so much he worried the paper might disintegrate. Good morning, David started, his voice coming out quieter than he intended. He cleared his throat and tried again. I'm David, and I've been working in this warehouse for 6 years. Today, I want to talk about something that affects all of us. Safety. 1. I want to. 1. As he spoke, his nervousness began to fade. This was familiar territory. He talked about the importance of proper lifting techniques, of wearing safety gear, even when it seemed unnecessary, of checking equipment before use. He kept it practical, sharing real examples from the warehouse floor. The most important thing about safety, David said, gaining confidence, is that we look out for each other. If you see something wrong, say something. Don't assume someone else will handle it. In an emergency, seconds matter. Sometimes the difference between tragedy and everyone going home safe is whether one person chooses to act. Victoria's attention sharpened. Something about his words resonated with her, striking a chord deep in her memory. David continued. A couple weeks ago, I saw an accident. A bad one. A car crash where someone was trapped inside, and the vehicle was about to go into the river. The room went quiet. Even Richard leaned forward slightly, interested. People drove by, David said softly. I'm sure they all had good reasons. They were scared. They didn't know what to do. They figured emergency services would handle it, but that person didn't have time to wait. So I stopped. I helped. Because that's what we should do for each other, whether it's here in the warehouse or out in the world. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. The voice, that was the voice from the bridge. Stay with me. I've got you. She gripped the edge of the table beside her, her legs suddenly unsteady. David wrapped up his presentation with a few more safety reminders, but Victoria barely heard them. Her mind was racing, her heart pounding. She studied his face, his hands, the way he carried himself. This was him. This was the man who'd risked his life to save hers. When David finished, the workers clapped. Richard stood and shook his hand firmly. Excellent presentation. Practical and honest. Exactly what I wanted to hear. Thank you, sir. David replied, relieved it was over. But as he turned to step away, Victoria moved forward. Her father looked at her in surprise. She was supposed to be conserving her energy, not actively participating in the tour. Mr. Chen, Victoria said, her voice slightly unsteady. That accident you mentioned, the one on the bridge, can you tell me more about it? David looked confused by the question. I'm not sure there's much more to tell. It was a rainy night. The car crashed through the guardrail. I pulled the driver out before the car fell into the river. What night was this? Victoria asked, though she already knew the answer. November 15th. About 2 weeks ago. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. She reached up and moved her hair aside, revealing the healing scar on her temple. I was that driver. The warehouse fell silent. You could have heard a pin drop. David stared at her, the pieces suddenly clicking into place. The familiar feeling when he'd seen her. The scar, the timing. You, he whispered. You saved my life, Victoria said, her voice breaking. I've been searching for you for 2 weeks. The police report was incomplete. We couldn't find you. And here you are. David didn't know what to say. He'd never expected to see her again. Had never even thought about trying to find out who she was. She was just someone who'd needed help. Richard Sterling's face showed pure shock. He looked at David with new eyes, understanding flooding through him. This warehouse worker, this ordinary man giving a safety presentation, had saved his daughter's life. had pulled her from a burning car, seconds before it plunged into the river. "You," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're the one who saved Victoria." David felt overwhelmed. "I just did what anyone should do." "But no one else did," Victoria said, stepping closer. "You were the only one who stopped. The only one brave enough to act. Do you have any idea what you gave back to me? What you gave back to my father?" Tears streamed down her face now, and she didn't bother to wipe them away. The other workers stood frozen, watching this moment unfold. "I was so scared," Victoria continued. "I remember hanging over that edge, trapped in my car, and thinking this was how it ended. Then, I heard your voice telling me to stay with you. I felt you pulling me out. You gave me a second chance at life." David's own eyes were wet now. He thought about Sophie, about how devastated she'd be if he hadn't come home that night. He thought about this woman's father, who would have lost his daughter if things had gone differently. "I'm just glad you're okay," David managed to say. "That's all that matters." Victoria wanted to hug him but sensed he was uncomfortable with all the attention. Instead, she composed herself slightly and asked, "Can we talk? Privately? There's so much I want to say. So much I need to thank you for." David glanced at Tony, who nodded enthusiastically. "Take all the time you need, Chen." Richard Sterling suggested they use the warehouse's small conference room. As they walked toward it, David caught glimpses of his co-workers' faces. They looked at him with a mixture of surprise, respect, and something else. Pride. They were proud to work alongside someone who'd done something truly heroic. Inside the conference room, Victoria sat down across from David while Richard stood nearby, giving them space but unable to leave. This was the man who'd saved his daughter. He needed to be part of this conversation. Victoria took a deep breath, composing her thoughts. She had so many questions, so much gratitude to express, but looking at David's humble, uncomfortable expression, she realized he wasn't someone who wanted a parade in his honor. He was just a good man who'd done the right thing. And now, sitting across from each other in a small conference room in a warehouse, their two very different worlds had collided in the most unexpected way. What happened next would change both of their lives forever. The conference room felt smaller than it was. David sat across from Victoria, acutely aware that the CEO of the entire company stood just a few feet away. His work uniform suddenly felt shabby compared to their expensive clothes. But Victoria's eyes held no judgment, only gratitude, and something else he couldn't quite name. "Tell me about yourself," Victoria said gently. "I know your name is David Chen, and you work here in the warehouse. But who are you? The man who risked his life for a stranger. He must be someone special." David shifted uncomfortably. "There's not much to tell. I'm just a regular guy trying to make a living." "You're a father," Richard said, remembering what Tony had mentioned during the tour. "You have a daughter." David's face softened immediately. "Yeah. Sophie. She's 8. She's everything to me." "Tell us about her," Victoria encouraged. Sensing this was the way to help him relax, so David did. He talked about how Sophie loved to sing, how she was performing in the winter concert next month. He mentioned her constant curiosity, the way she asked a million questions about everything, how she still liked him to read her stories at bedtime even though she could read them herself now. "It's just the two of us," David added quietly. "My wife, Linda, passed away 3 years ago. Cancer." Victoria's expression filled with compassion. "I'm so sorry. That must be incredibly hard. Some days more than others," David admitted. "But Sophie keeps me going. She's the reason I get up every morning, the reason I work as hard as I do." Richard understood that completely. After losing his own wife, Victoria had become his whole world. The thought of what could have happened on that bridge made his chest tight. "When you pulled me from that car," Victoria said. David shook his head. "I didn't know anything except that someone needed help. Honestly, If I'd stopped to think about it, I probably would have been too scared to act. But there wasn't time to think. There was only time to move. Most people froze, Richard said. The police interviewed witnesses. Several people saw the crash, slowed down, looked, and kept driving. They all had reasons. Too dangerous. Not their responsibility. Someone else would handle it. I can't judge them for that, David said. Fear is real. But I kept thinking, what if that was Sophie in that car? What if it was someone I loved, and people just drove past? Victoria wiped at her eyes. I need you to understand something. You didn't just save me that night. You saved my father from losing another person he loves. You gave us both a future we wouldn't have had. I'm just grateful I was there, David said simply, that I could help. Victoria and her father exchanged glances. They'd discussed this possibility during the ride to the warehouse. Victoria spoke carefully. David, we want to do something for you. To thank you properly. David immediately tensed. That's not necessary. I didn't do it for a reward. We know that, Richard said. That's exactly why we want to help. Please, hear us out. Victoria leaned forward. I've looked at your employment record. You've been here 6 years. You're always on time, you never complain, and your supervisors say you're one of the most reliable workers they have. You pick up extra shifts, constantly. David felt exposed, like they were seeing parts of his life he kept private. I have bills to pay, a daughter to raise. You're overqualified for your current position, Victoria continued. You have leadership skills, excellent communication abilities, and natural problem-solving instincts. We have an opening for operations manager, better hours, significantly better pay, and opportunities for advancement. I can't accept that, David said immediately. It would be charity. I don't want special treatment because of what happened. It's not charity, Richard insisted. It's recognizing talent we've overlooked. How many other good people do we have working in positions below their capabilities because they don't have the right connections or because no one's really paying attention? Victoria nodded. Your presentation today proved what you're capable of. You spoke clearly, connected with your audience, and shared valuable insights. Those are management skills, David. Your presentation sensorily, your presentation skills. We're not inventing a position for you. We're offering you one you're qualified for. David wanted to refuse. Pride made him want to say no. But he thought about Sophie's winter boots, about the school concerts he sometimes missed because of late shifts, about the stack of bills on his kitchen counter. He thought about having time to actually be present in his daughter's life, instead of constantly scrambling. I don't know, he said honestly. This feels like too much. It's not enough. Victoria said softly. You gave me my life back. But I understand if this makes you uncomfortable. At least, think about it. Before David could respond, Richard spoke. There's something else. Something that has nothing to do with business, or positions, or any of that. He pulled out his phone and showed David a photo. It was a family picture. Richard, with his wife, and a young Victoria, maybe 10 years old. They were laughing. Happy. Full of life. I took this 20 years ago, Richard said. 2 years later, my wife got sick. By the time Victoria was 13, she was gone. For years, it was just the two of us, learning how to be a family without the person who held us together. David saw the parallel immediately. A parent and child, navigating loss together. When Victoria had that accident, Richard continued, his voice thick with emotion. I almost lost her too. Almost became a man with nothing but memories and an empty house. You stopped that from happening. So please, let me say thank you not as a CEO, but as a father who understands exactly what you're protecting when you think about Sophie. The sincerity in his voice broke through David's defenses. This wasn't about money, or positions, or corporate politics. This was about two fathers who understood that nothing mattered more than the children they loved. My daughter and I would like to invite you and Sophie to dinner, Richard said. At our home. Just as a gesture of gratitude. Would you consider that? David thought about it. A dinner wasn't a job offer. It wasn't money or charity. It was just two families sharing a meal. Okay, he said. I think Sophie would like that. Victoria smiled, genuine and warm. How about this Saturday? If that works for you, Saturday should be fine. They exchanged contact information. Victoria wrote down her personal number and email. I mean it about the position, she said. At least think about it. Talk it over with Sophie, maybe. See how she feels. David nodded. He wasn't ready to commit, but he wouldn't dismiss it entirely either. When they left the conference room, the warehouse had returned to normal operations. Workers were busy with their tasks. Though David caught several curious glances his way, Tony approached with a grin that stretched ear to ear. Well? Tony asked. They invited Sophie and me to dinner on Saturday, David said, still processing everything. That's all. David glanced toward the door where Victoria and her father were preparing to leave. They offered me a promotion. Operations manager. Tony's eyes went wide. And? I haven't decided yet. Are you crazy? That's an amazing opportunity. Maybe, David said. But I need to think about it. Make sure it's real, and not just guilt or gratitude talking. Tony clapped him on the shoulder. You're a good man, Chen. But don't let pride make you stupid. If the opportunity's real, take it. You've earned it, rescue or no rescue. That evening, David picked up Sophie from after-school care. She immediately asked about his presentation. It went really well, David said. Actually, something kind of amazing happened. He told her the story as they drove home. About how the woman he'd saved from the bridge turned out to be the daughter of the company owner. About how they'd been searching for him. About the dinner invitation. Sophie's eyes got huge. Really? We're going to have dinner at their house? If you want to, it might be a little fancy. I want to go. Maybe she can tell us what it was like being rescued by my dad. David laughed. Maybe. After Sophie went to bed that night, David sat at his small kitchen table with a cup of tea. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator. He thought about the offer Victoria had made. Operations manager. Better pay. Better hours. He thought about what Linda would say if she were here. She'd always believed in him. Always said he was capable of more than he gave himself credit for. She'd probably tell him to take the chance. But was it real? Or would he show up to this new position and realize he was in over his head, only there because he'd pulled someone from a car? His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Hi, David. It's Victoria. I wanted you to have my number for Saturday. Also, I meant what I said about the position. You've proven your character and capabilities. The job is yours if you want it. But no pressure. We're grateful either way. And David stared at the message for a long moment. He set the phone down and looked around his small apartment. The worn furniture, the stack of bills, the photos of Linda and Sophie on the wall. This was his life. Humble. Simple. But maybe, just maybe, doing the right thing on a rainy night could lead to something good. Maybe life had a way of rewarding kindness when you least expected it. David finished his tea and headed to bed. Saturday would be interesting. And after that, well, he'd cross that bridge when he came to it. He'd gotten pretty good at handling bridges lately. Saturday arrived with Sophie bouncing around the apartment like a firecracker. She'd insisted on wearing her favorite dress, the blue one with white flowers that Linda had bought her before she got sick. David had ironed it carefully, making sure every wrinkle was gone. Do I look okay, Daddy? Sophie asked for the 10th time, twirling in front of the mirror. You look beautiful, sweetheart, David said, adjusting his own tie. He'd borrowed it from his neighbor, because he didn't own one. The nicest thing in his closet was a button-down shirt he usually saved for parent-teacher conferences. They drove across town to an address Victoria had texted him. The neighborhood changed as they went. Houses getting bigger, yards getting wider, Sophie pressed her face to the window, eyes wide at the mansions they passed. "These houses are huge," she whispered. When they pulled up to the Sterling residence, David's old truck looked out of place among the manicured lawns and iron gates. He almost turned around, but then he saw Victoria standing at the front door, waving with a genuine smile, and his nerves settled a bit. "You made it," Victoria said as they walked up. She'd dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, probably sensing that formal wear would make them uncomfortable. "And you must be Sophie." Sophie nodded shyly, suddenly quiet despite all her excitement on the drive over. "I'm so glad you're here," Victoria said, kneeling down to Sophie's level. "Your dad is pretty amazing. You know that?" Sophie's shyness melted away. "I know. He's the best dad in the whole world." Richard appeared behind Victoria, also dressed casually. "Welcome to our home. Please, come in." The house was beautiful but not overwhelming. Yes, it was big, but it felt lived in. Family photos lined the walls. A cozy living room had books scattered on the coffee table. David had expected something cold and formal, but this felt like a real home where real people lived. Dinner was simple too. Grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, fresh bread. Nothing fancy or intimidating. They sat in a dining room that overlooked a garden, and as they ate, the conversation flowed naturally. Sophie told them about her upcoming winter concert, about how she was nervous for her solo. Victoria encouraged her, sharing a story about her own stage fright as a kid. Richard asked about Sophie's favorite subjects in school, nodding thoughtfully at her answers. David watched his daughter come alive in this conversation, saw her confidence grow. These wealthy, powerful people were treating her like she mattered, like her thoughts and dreams were important. After dinner, Victoria asked if Sophie wanted to see something special. She led them to a music room David hadn't noticed before. A beautiful piano sat by the window. "Do you play?" Victoria asked Sophie. "A little. We learned some songs in music class. Want to try this one?" Victoria sat down and patted the bench beside her. Sophie climbed up, and together, they played a simple melody. Sophie's face glowed with joy. Richard gestured for David to join him on the back patio, leaving the girls to their music. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink. "She's a wonderful kid," Richard said. "You're doing an incredible job with her." "I'm trying my best," David replied. "Some days, I feel like I'm failing, like she deserves better than what I can give her." "I felt that way too," Richard admitted. "After my wife died, I threw myself into work. I told myself I was building a future for Victoria, providing for her, but really, I was hiding from the grief, from the fact that I didn't know how to be both parents." David understood that feeling completely. "One day Victoria sat me down," Richard continued. "She was about 14. She told me she didn't need a bigger house or fancier vacations. She just needed her dad, present, paying attention, showing up." He paused. "That conversation changed everything for me." "Sophie's said similar things," David said quietly. "She tells me all the time that we don't need much as long as we have each other." "Smart kid." Richard turned to face David directly. "I want to talk to you about something. Not as your CEO, but as one father to another." David braced himself. "Take the promotion," Richard said. "Not because you saved Victoria, though I'll be grateful for that, until my last breath. Take it because you deserve it. Because Sophie deserves to have a father who doesn't have to work 70 hours a week to keep the lights on. Because you've earned the chance to use your talents for something more." 9. "What if I'm not good enough?" David asked, voicing the fear that had kept him awake at night. "What if I fail? What if I fail?" "Then you'll learn and do better next time," Richard said simply. "That's what I did. That's what everyone does. The difference between people who succeed and people who don't isn't that successful people never fail. It's that they're willing to try." Inside, they could hear Sophie and Victoria laughing, the piano music floating through the open door. "I built this company from nothing," Richard continued. Started with one truck and a dream. Made 1,000 mistakes along the way. Lost money. Lost clients. Had people tell me I'd never make it. But I kept trying because I had someone depending on me. Just like you have Sophie. Depending on you. David looked at this man who seemed to have everything. But he saw past the wealth and success to the person underneath. A father who'd lost his wife. A man who'd almost lost his daughter. Someone who understood exactly what it meant to carry the weight of being everything for one precious person. "Okay," David said. "I'll take the position." Richard's face broke into a genuine smile. "Good. You start in 2 weeks. That'll give you time to transition." They shook hands, and it felt like more than a business agreement. It felt like a mutual respect between two men who'd walked similar paths. When they went back inside, Victoria and Sophie were deep in conversation about music and school and life. Victoria caught David's eye and smiled, understanding passing between them. As the evening wound down and David and Sophie prepared to leave, Victoria walked them to the door. She handed Sophie a wrapped package. "What's this?" Sophie asked. "Open it when you get home," Victoria said with a wink. In the car, Sophie clutched the package in her lap. "Can I open it now? Please?" David laughed. "Go ahead." Inside was a beautiful journal with Sophie's name embossed on the cover, and tucked inside was a gift card to a music store. Victoria had included a note that Sophie read aloud. "For the girl, with the beautiful voice and the brave father. Never stop singing. Love, Victoria." Sophie hugged the journal to her chest. "I really like her, Dad." "Me too, sweetheart." Over the following weeks, David started his new position. It was challenging, sometimes overwhelming, but Victoria and Richard were patient. They gave him training and support. More importantly, they gave him confidence. The better hours meant David could take Sophie to school every morning, could be there for every concert and parent-teacher conference, could make dinner most nights instead of rushing in exhausted at 9 o'clock. Sophie's winter concert arrived. David sat in the front row, right next to Victoria and Richard, who'd asked if they could attend. When Sophie stepped forward for her solo, her voice clear and sweet, David's eyes filled with tears. This was what it was all about. Not the money or the position or any of that. It was about being present for moments like this. About giving his daughter a father who was there, not just in body but in spirit. After the concert, Sophie ran to them, her face flushed with excitement. Victoria hugged her tight. "You were magnificent." Richard shook her hand seriously, like she was an adult. "Outstanding performance, young lady." But Sophie saved her biggest hug for David. "You came, Daddy. You were here." "Wouldn't have missed it for the world," David said, holding her close. As they walked to the parking lot together, the four of them, David realized something profound. He'd saved Victoria's life that rainy night on the bridge, but in doing so, she'd saved his too, not from physical danger, but from a life of constant struggle, from missing out on his daughter's childhood, from believing he couldn't be more than he was. Kindness, it turned out, had a way of coming full circle. You gave it freely, expecting nothing back. And sometimes, in the most unexpected ways, the universe returned it tenfold. A few months later, Victoria launched a company program in partnership with David. They called it the Community Heroes Initiative. It recognized employees and community members who went above and beyond to help others. It provided scholarships for their children, offered career development opportunities, and most importantly, celebrated the everyday people who made the world better through simple acts of courage and compassion. At the launch event, David spoke briefly. He talked about that night on the bridge, about choosing to stop when others didn't. But he also talked about what came after, about how one moment of doing the right thing had changed everything for him and Sophie. "I'm not special," David told the audience. "I'm just someone who decided that another person's life mattered more than my own fear. And I'm asking all of you to remember that we all have that choice. every single day. To help or to look away. To act or to assume someone else will. To be the person who stops. The audience stood and applauded. Sophie sat in the front row next to Victoria, beaming with pride at her father. Richard watched with satisfaction, grateful every day for the man who'd given him his daughter back. Life wasn't perfect. David still had challenges and struggles, but now he had support, opportunity, and hope. He had a found family in Victoria and Richard. He had a career with real potential. Most importantly, he had time with Sophie. Time to be the father she deserved. And it all started because on one rainy night, faced with a choice between safety and sacrifice, between convenience and courage, David Chen chose to stop, chose to help, chose to be the person the world needed, even if no one was watching. Sometimes that's all it takes to change everything. One person willing to act. One moment of bravery. One choice to believe that doing the right thing matters, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. That's when it matters most.